Okay, so after our sitting tonight, the topic for discussion is going to be right effort, sometimes referred to as right energy. Those are actually two different things. But the thing I like about this topic is that if you like to be a student of Buddhism and particularly of the Buddha's life, you see that there is an absolute direct relationship between the Buddha's pre-awakening practices and his subsequent teachings on this topic. And he believed that right effort was the path factor. There's eight path factors, the Eightfold Path. There's three trainings of the Eightfold Path. The Buddha believed that right effort was what animated all seven other path factors. Um, and we identify with our energy levels so much that until you get sick or you have surgery and you're recovering from surgery and suddenly, you've got 60% of your normal energy, you don't appreciate just how absolutely significant energy is and um, being awake to it and modifying it so that it collaborates with the purpose of what you're doing. And so that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. I think it's a really fun topic. And I would encourage you, I'm going to give a couple suggestions once we start sitting, to hold an open question during the sitting of what role does energy play in your practice? So on a sitting like this, after a long day, do you just sit down and not even really um, carefully look at your energy and how it might influence the whole course of your meditation? And then are you awake to the quality of your mind states and your awareness and how that relates to your energy and making adjustments so that your awareness and your contact with the sensations in your body and the purposefulness of your practice, you're really actually anchored in it rather than drifting. So, okay. So we're going to sit for about 25, 30 minutes. And I don't have a bell. The Zoom I have, when I hit the bell, you can't hear it. It, it, it's amazing. So I'll just bring us out of the sitting at the end of the sitting. Okay. So take a few moments to arrive in this particular place that you're at right now. And as an invitation, you can follow these or you can do what you normally do. But just take a moment to open up to the body as a whole and uh, the amount and quality of energy that is present in the body and then in the mind. And those may be two different things. They may be similar or they may be coordinated, but they can be different. And it may be that you're bringing the energy of outward focus that you've been in all day into the sitting. And that's a different kind of energy, an energy that's at a grosser level than the interior, more quiet space that we're moving into now, that requires the energy to settle, to be calmer, to be more quiet, and to be primarily receptive rather than doing. In my own case, I find that your posture or my posture is a bellwether for my energy. So that if you can get into a position that allows the energy to move freely and unobstructed through the body, you have a much better chance of staying present and connected. So I like to try to find a place where my hips are balanced on my sits bones and the knees are at a 90-degree angle so that your hips and your legs and your feet are creating a stable platform for your upper body. And then you can release your abdomen and release your lower back and just allow the upper body to settle into that stability. If that doesn't feel that way, if you don't have that sense when you release the abdomen and the lower back that the upper body is just settling into the stability of the hips, the hips probably need to be moved a little bit forward or a little bit back. You can experiment with that. But this allows the entire upper body to be relaxed, not needing to hold the posture. And then you can just move your awareness into the spine and feel the spine erect in a relaxed way, all the way from the top of the head, all the way down to the bottom of the hips. And I invite you during this sitting to periodically check in and see if your posture is still in this relaxed, comfortable, but really alert, energized position, or whether that's changed. So you can reset. The key to right energy is that we're awake to the quality of energy and its effect on our awareness, and that we're making small adjustments and balances to keep our energy bright and alert and awake. In the last few minutes of this sitting, just allow the awareness to begin to slowly move back out, broaden itself into the body as a whole. And if you're so inclined, take a minute to take a look at the posture and see if it's different than when you started and if the body is alert and alive and is the quality of the awareness and mindfulness that's present, bright and alert. And you might reflect for a second. I think this can be helpful at the end of the meditation if you're working on something like right effort, just to reflect back on the sitting and see what, if anything, took place in terms of energy, if the mind was aware of that or not. Were there different types and amounts of energy, and how did that affect awareness and your ability to stay present and to work with things? Whether you learned anything in this sitting about energy. And then allow the awareness to expand a little bit more so it starts to go outside of the body, situating yourself in the chair, the couch, or a bench, or on the floor in the room. And whenever you're ready, we can slowly begin to open our eyes and come back together as a group, as a whole. So thank you very much. Okay, so we are going to take, as the usual practice, like just a very short little break, 5, 6 minutes, and we'll do that now, and then we'll come back and jump back in, and I look forward to that. Okay, thank you.
Dennis, this is Jen from the hall. I just want to say
Yes.
hello again, and we are ready for you when you are ready for us.
Good.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, everybody, back again. Welcome. This evening's discussion is going to be on right effort, right energy, the path factor that animates um, all of the other path factors of the Eightfold Path. And just as a note, there is a handout which is on the website, and I'm not sure may appear in the notes on the side here for later use. I'm not going to be referring to it during the talk, but it highlights a number of the points that I'll be making and hopefully that we'll be discussing. Um, so one of the things that I really like about this topic is that the historical Buddha was so clear how important this is. And in my opinion, it's a topic which is under considered at a community level of practice. And as we go through this tonight, I think you'll see how practical the discussion is about this and how useful it is in terms of a solid practice and a maturing practice. And the other thing is that if you like to be a student of the historical Buddha's life and how his life translated into teachings, this is a topic which shows a direct link between his pre-awakening experience and his subsequent teachings about effort and energy. So I want to start with a story from my own practice about right effort. And this is many, many years ago. I was on one of my first, what I considered to be a longer retreat. It was 2 or 3 weeks. Um, we were out maybe, I don't know, 10, 11 days. And so your quietness is getting, very solid. The focus is really good. And the instruction by the teachers was emphasizing focusing on the motivation or urge that takes place just before something happens. So um, if you're eating, uh, the urge that takes place, the motivation to pick up the fork or the spoon, the urge that takes place before you lift your foot, this kind of thing. And at that stage of the practice, you've really slowed down. And some people, and I was one of them, you're walking and moving very, very slowly, and kind of having these experiences, particularly if you haven't had them before, that are really exquisite and they're encouraging. They're inspiring. Um, so I was walking back to my room, and I'm, walking very, very slowly, noticing each one of my steps and the lengths of the steps. And then I get to the door and I notice the urge to reach for the doorknob and then touching the doorknob and the sensations and the urge to turn the doorknob. And I do it and I walk in the room and I realize that I'm in a storage closet. Um, so this story is an illustration of that your effort has to be connected with the purpose of what you're doing. And this isn't a particularly good illustration of right effort, but it does illustrate that you can think that you're doing something really well, and actually it's not connected with a larger purpose. So the historical Buddha said that we have to match our effort with the purpose of each of the eightfold path factors, and they have to match. So that means that we really have to be awake, and that fundamentally, and this is the exciting thing about this topic, is that fundamentally right effort is linked with right view, so that it's exploratory, it's trial and error, and it's discovery ongoing. Because as conditions change, the type of effort that I need to use to um, have more continuous mindfulness, or the type of energy that I need to bring up my effort, or the type of effort that I need to bring in kindness or equanimity. All of those are slightly different. And so we have to learn how to do that. So, uh, right effort is about learning how to use our energy to grow skillful qualities and uproot unskillful ones. And in the end, it's about using our energy either to reinforce habits of craving and separateness and identification, or gradually diminishing and dismantling those. So it's helpful to distinguish energy from effort. Energy is the force or the power that animates the body and the mind. I mean, at its most fundamental definition. And effort is the application or the direction of energy. And then right effort is the application or the direction of our energy in a way that animates the psychology, the teachings, and the methods of the historical Buddha, that it animates and it embodies the Dharma. And we can make practice very complex, but if you do even the simplest research on right effort, it shows how the Buddha had um, brought everything down into these various concise categories of practice. And the historical Buddha said that there were four types of right effort with respect to wholesome or skillful states of mind. Right effort was arousing skillful states of mind that weren't already present when we need them. And if a skillful or wholesome state of mind is already present, that we maintain it or we increase it. And similarly, with unwholesome or unskillful states of mind, there were two. One was to prevent or restrain unskillful or unwholesome states of mind from arising, and once they did arise, to abandon them. So that in the end, there are four types of right effort, two with wholesome and skillful states of mind, two with unwholesome and unskillful states of mind. And the purposefulness of right effort breaks into two large applications. So the first one is using our efforts to balance the mind and the heart so we can see clearly, or see as clearly as we can, to make wise choices. And there's a very famous sutta, which you may have heard of, that illustrates this point. It's called the Lute, Lute, like the instrument, the Lute Sutta. And sometimes it's referred to the Sona as the Sona Sutta. Sona was a senior monk who is engaged in an exchange with the Buddha about difficulties that he's having in practice, and saying that he's feeling exhausted and fatigued and having trouble with his energy. And the Buddha admonishes Sona for over efforting, for being basically hyper vigilant in trying to be mindful and to practice, and links over efforting and hypervigilance with the result, which is exhaustion in both the body and the mind. And because the body and the mind are fatigued or exhausted, that our experience, our perception, our mindfulness becomes distorted. And this links directly to the historical Buddha's pre-awakening experiences. You may have heard, most of you, the stories that for roughly 7 years prior to his awakening, he studied with a small group, didn't study, he practiced with a small group of um, 5 practitioners, and also under the guidance off and on of two of the leading meditation teachers of the day. And it didn't work. He ended up walking away from all the concentration and um, other practices. And he said that this 7 years of practice, which was uh, based on trying to manage and control the body through denying it things, through deep states of concentration, is that the end result of that was weariness, fatigue, exhaustion, disillusionment, disappointment, and actually a turning away from the practice. I mean, this is like a huge point. It's important to get that the historical Buddha was practicing all of these fairly extreme concentration and denial practices, and practices which were taking him into very beautiful, but beautiful states of mind removed from daily life, which he couldn't sustain in daily life, and that his reaction to that was actually to walk away from those practices. And he later said that all of that practice didn't produce anything of insight value. And this is an insight practice, understanding. It taught him all kinds of things about what he shouldn't do, but it didn't lead him to insight. So the image that he presents to Sona of how to work with energy is that it should be like tuning a lute or a guitar or a violin, any stringed instrument. And what we're trying to do with our energy and our related state of mind is to find the right amount of effort that supports the purpose, so it's not too tight or too loose, that we're adjusting and calibrating the balance through listening and feeling and experiencing through trial and error. So it's multi-dimensional, and that's the only way that it can be knowing. It has to be through trial and error, direct experience. And then we can connect the purpose, in this case, to find the right tightness of those strings so that you get the right tone for each one of the strings, and then you can play the instrument, and you're anchored in that. And so the sutta is about how you do this is through seeing and feeling, um, and that you're watching to see when that balance is not present and the effect that it has. So if we have, and you may relate this just when I am on this little piece that I'm going to do right now, think about the last sitting. So if you have too little effort that is directed towards maintaining your concentration, your presence, your mindfulness, the mind will drift. There's a lack of clarity. Um, Frequently, when there's too little effort, we actually don't know what we're experiencing. We have sleepiness, um, and we have sluggishness of the body energy. And if we have too much, then there's a sense of tension. There's actually an inability to hold awareness, and the tension is both, can be in either the body or the mind or both. We can feel anxious, restless, and we start over efforting and using force. So one of the uh, easiest reference points on this, I think, is to think of the five hindrances. And the five hindrances are classically the five major obstacles in practice, and they are desire, aversion, sloth, and torpor. You know, this is sluggishness and dullness of either the body or the mind, restlessness slash anxiety, anxiousness, and doubt. So we'll talk about desire and aversion in a few minutes. Those are actually the cause of everything. But how does energy relate to sloth and torpor? Well, it's obviously that the energy has not been maintained, so that the energy in the mind drops and then we lose our mindfulness. Or the energy in our body drops and then we get sleepy. Uh, Restlessness and anxiety, what is the relationship to energy there? It's too much energy that for the awareness that we have at the moment. So the awareness, mindfulness, can't hold the energy that's there. So we become restless and anxious, and the antidote to that is to concentrate the mind. And then doubt. So I think this one is kind of interesting because for some people it's not so obvious. How would doubt relate to energy? And doubt actually is also where there's too much effort, and it's of a particular kind of effort, and that is circular thinking, papancha, speculation, so that the mind just keeps going to questions, asking them, not answering them, can't come to a conclusion, and it becomes circular and energetic. And then you just get lost in the doubt in that energy cycle, which is too much for the restless, the mindfulness and the awareness. And unless you break it, then you're just stuck in the doubt. So the really the walk away for this first part of the first application of balance is that it's dynamic, and that mindfulness needs to be wakeful and identify the type and quantity and quality of energy that's present. And if it's not in balance, do things to adjust and either bring it up or bring it down. And when you understand it this way, you realize this applies to like literally every moment of our life, um, every time we sit. And the fascinating thing about it is that it's usually running under the radar and we don't even see it. And so the question, I think, which is the really fascinating question is, well, why does that happen? If this is such a critical factor, if it's basically driving everything else, um, why don't we see it? Why aren't we connected with it? And the answer to that question is identification, is that we identify with the states of mind that are being produced by the effort. So we say, I'm tired or I'm angry, rather than saying, well, the conditions in my body have changed, and now my energy has dropped, or I become frustrated and I've got all of this angry energy. So the difference between those two is everything. In one case, we're just identifying with the energy and the state of mind and not actually seeing what it is from a dharmic perspective, from a practice perspective. And in the other case, we actually see it and have the ability to work with it. So that leads us to the second of the two applications. The first one is where we're trying to balance the energy in the body and the mind so that we can actually see this energy and how it's affecting our moods, our thoughts, our intentions, our emotions. Um, the second application is that we're actually using the first one, getting the mind in balance and the body in balance, to actually do the real work of practice, which is to carefully watch which way our efforts are pointing the mind and the heart. Is it pointing it towards suffering? Is it pointing it towards clarity and understanding? And this is a real shift because, and this is the shift of purposefulness, because we're moving from trying to manage and control and manipulate our mind states and energy, uh, uh, rather than trying to deeply understand them, uh, to have insight into how the energy is driving the mind state so that we can have choices in what we're thinking, what we're feeling, in our relationships and our practice. And so we move from um, a more conventional approach where we're trying to control and manage our emotions all the time to actually collaborating with the conditions in our life, the circumstances, and the energy in our body and our mind. The Buddha once again simplified this and said that there is a centerpiece or an anchor for working in this way, and that there are three core or root unwholesome motivations that are responsible for all of our suffering, all of our afflictive emotions and defilements, which he classified as secondary. So, we look as having an anger or hostility or selfishness or an arrogance or a pride problem. the Buddha considered those secondary, so that there are three core motivations from which all of those flow, which are greed, hatred, and delusion. And modernly we say desire, aversion, and delusion, or confusion. So the mechanism here is that desire and aversion destabilize our awareness and our mindfulness. Desire and aversion arouse the mind, and it results in confusion or distortion, so that we don't see clearly. So the practice, from an energetic standpoint, is really simplified. It's to identify the root motivation, the start of the suffering process, desire, aversion, or delusion. And once again, this relates back directly to the historical Buddha's pre-awakening practices. So his pre-awakening practices were extreme practices which were designed to subdue and manage and control all the energies in the body and the mind. And the body was actually considered almost like an enemy, an obstacle, and all the sensations of the body were suspect, and so were the energies of the mind. So that all of those practices were about denial or control or management, or in the alternative, moving into altered states of consciousness where you disassociated yourself from the body and from reality. And so for me, the big message is that he walked away from those and that he moved towards being embodied and not managing and controlling, but insight, experientially, deeply understanding what's happening in our body and our mind energetically, leading to insight and discovery. And then we use that as the basis for making choices, which is different than just immediately trying to manage and control, which is fundamentally uninformed. So the practice is having insight and discovery about the states of mind and how energy drives the states of mind. And then when we understand that, we have a basis for making decisions about what to do. And this is basically the second noble truth, that craving is the original start. So desire and aversion are craving, which leads to attachment, separation, and identification. Boom. So this practice is a shift from management and control to understanding and adapting and collaborating with our life. So this kind of approach to practice for some people is quite different, because it requires a level of awakeness and awareness that, I mean, truly is um, in the moment. Like what's happening right now with the energy. Why am I sleepy? Why am I sluggish? Why am I feeling anxious? And taking it to these three root causes and the nature of the original causes, rather than dealing with the secondary results of the causes. And so, if you practice this way, what I found is even walking into a dark storage closet can be an important step on the path. So, okay. So I think I'm going to end it there so we can have a little bit of time to talk about this. Uh, Thoughts, questions, comments?
Thank you, Ken. I'm just going to say this is Jen from the meditation hall, and I'm happy to pass the microphone so that anything that is said in this hall can be heard by our friends on Zoom. And to our friends on Zoom, if you want to raise a real hand or a virtual hand, either Dennis or I can call on you. Okay, Dennis, I'm going to pass the mic here in the hall.
Okay, good.
Great. Start with your name and hold.
I don't know if I don't know if everybody noted this, but over my left-hand shoulder, you may be able to see my little Yorkie Terrier. And this would be an illustration of wrong effort. His idea is, I've really tried, but the whole mindfulness thing doesn't work for him. So either when I meditate or when I talk, he just lays down and goes to sleep. So,
My name is Nan. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about confusion and where that laid in the path and what you were talking about. I heard it and related, but if there was more you could say.
yeah. What I was trying to say is, and kind of the theme of this talk is that there is a direct relationship between the energy in the body and the mind and the mind states that we are experiencing. And one way to get out of the narrative that traps us about what's happening is to actually go to the body and the energy in the body and the mind. So, with the hindrance of doubt, doubt is basically the inability of the mind to settle on an issue and stay connected with it and work through it and make a decision. So that in this, it's basically another form of restlessness. So that when our mind is strong and our mindfulness is good and it's concentrated, the awareness can connect with whatever is taking place and stay there and discern what is happening. Are there sensations in the body? Are there related emotions? Are there related thoughts? But when there's the awareness isn't strong enough to hold all that energy, what happens is rather than there being a connection and anchoring in the present moment, the mind just keeps doing this. Awareness just keeps doing that. And then that is, in terms of our thoughts, what we call papancha, which is speculative thinking that in itself leads nowhere. It's non-productive thinking. So is that helpful at all?
It's helpful. I could have you talk about it for a whole nother hour, I think, to just
Well,
understanding how you change that,
yeah, well, maybe
change
that's the
that
next
doubt.
talk. Yeah, because both with restlessness and doubt, and there's when you look at it, there's different recommendations between the two of them, but the commonality is that both of them have to do with calming and stabilizing the energy in the body and the mind. So classically, with restlessness and anxiety, it's concentration practice. So, I mean, that could be focusing on a single object, like your breath or body scans or metta. The metta is a concentration practice. It's not an insight practice. And then with doubt, the recommendations are historically a little bit different. It's like to reflect on the Dharma and the Buddha. And my own experience with doubt is that I need to calm and stabilize my mind first before I try any other of the recommended antidotes. Because unless the mind has calmed down enough to work a little bit, then when I do the other practices, I just end up in papancha with those as well.
Thank you.
Carol, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Hi, Dennis.
Hey,
Um,
good evening.
good evening. I hope you know that John is available if you want to phone him. I'm sure he would really appreciate a phone call if you haven't talked to him recently.
I spoke with him yesterday.
Great, great, great.
Yeah, and for those of you who well, this is a day old report. He's settled in. Uh, uh, he's living with his son in Bend, Oregon, and I saw him several times while he was here in Sacramento right after. he had had the stroke and he was in the hospital. And, he's starting to adjust and settle into the current new reality. And, John's, there's a number of wonderful qualities that John's always had. He's been fiercely independent, so this is difficult for him. But he's always had this calmness of mind, and when he was going through, his cancer treatments and all of that, he was able to hold it in a very big way. And so, of course, there's a bunch of concern and anxiety, but from my perspective, he's doing surprisingly well right now, and really devoted to the rehab process that he's in. So we had a great discussion, and I'm looking forward to more and to his recovery.
Yes. Great. So I want to talk about the difference between eyes open and eyes shut during meditation. And I've been studying, I've been practicing with my eyes open, and I'm finding I have a lot of energy when my eyes are open. And then when I close them, which is a lot of the instruction is now close your eyes, and concentrate on your breath. I tend to get tired or sleepy. And I wonder if there's a way of overcoming that with your eyes closed. Because when I had that sleepiness, I would open them briefly when I was doing it that way. But now with my eyes open, I'm fine. But occasionally the instruction is close your eyes. So what do you think about? Have you experimented with eyes open, eyes closed
I
yourself?
have, and I think what's important to realize is that all of these are methods, and it's not that none of this is cast in stone. So, in some traditions, they really encourage you to have your eyes open, and they give various reasons for that, and others, your eyes closed. So, I personally find that when my eyes are closed, I tend to go much deeper in my meditations, and a more kind of depth experience of the relationships between sensations and thoughts and emotions and dharmas. But that could be because that's how I've been trained. Because I have people in other traditions who practice with their eyes open, and uh, I think the key is when you do it with your eyes open, you don't have your eyes open in the sense that we have them open right now, where you're kind of back in your everyday awareness and watching movement and everything. Your eyes are open, but it's more of a kind of a holding stare. You're still seeing everything, but the purpose isn't to be seen. It's to be open to energetically the light and everything that's coming in. But what I found over, now a very long Dharma history, that it's helpful to experiment and to try different methods and find out what is home base. And, I mean, my experiments with having my eyes open, going on Zen retreats in particular, just helped reinforce that for me, the value of having my eyes closed as a practice method is what worked for me. So you have to, you have to discover that for yourself, not just follow what somebody's told you. Now, as what to do about it, I think the reason, and just think about you're sitting right now. I honestly believe that on we meet on Thursday night, you meet on Monday and other nights. My guess is that a fairly large number of people, after a long day, end up being in a semi, not sleep state, but being very sluggish mentally. And they're not actually having real clarity about what they're experiencing, but they're just identifying with it. That's just that they've just fallen into the habit of doing that. So if there's a walk away from this talk and then the sitting, is that right effort is actually being about awake to the effort in your body and your mind and how it's affecting your awareness. So that if you close your eyes and you start falling asleep, well, it's an energy issue. So it's not just, oh gosh, I'm falling asleep. It's that, okay, what do I do about it? How do I bring my energy up? Uh, and there's all kinds of different ways that you can do that. Or that if you have too much energy, that you're restless, that you actually recognize that the issue isn't really restlessness, it's too much energy. So that you do something to calm and stabilize that energy. And this is what takes us out of the narrative and all of the habitual habits of like, I don't like this, I don't like that. The state, no, it's an energetic problem. And if we can start practicing more at that level, my own experience is that it's a real jump start on staying out of narrative and struggle and improving your practice. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope that was a little helpful. That was kind of long. Okay, maybe one more before we close, if there is one more. As you can see, Bailey woke up. I think that question about what to do about sleepiness, he actually heard that. Okay, so I'm taking it that I'm not hearing anything, that there aren't any further comments or questions. I'd like to thank all of you in Mountain Stream for the opportunity to share with you tonight. I consider this one of the real joys of my life, of being able to talk about and share my individual perspective about the Dharma. And so may the cumulative effort of all of our good intentions tonight to explore this and the merit of all of this in some really tangible way support people suffering less in the world and experiencing some really true measure of just a little bit more happiness. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dennis. If you're online, please feel free to unmute and say goodnight, and the rest of us can wave. Good to see you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for the talk. Thank you, Sangha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Wonderful to see you again.